This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk Live. I am your host, Rob Port. You know, we have a big debate going on in this country about a lot of things. We're debating everything in this country. It's a democracy. Why wouldn't we be? No, we're debating wind power. And, you know, I think it's unfortunate sometimes because, you know, people form into camps around this issue. And it's like, well, I'm a certain political persuasion, or I'm from a certain part of the country, therefore I have to be for renewables, or I'm from another part of the country and I'm conservative, so I have to be for coal or something. And I think that's unfortunate because this shouldn't be part of the culture war. We should be making decisions about energy based on reality. Now, one of the debates about, you know, base load electricity like coal power or nuclear power and renewable energy is that a lot of it's focused on base load versus intermittent energy. And that's a very important part of the debate, and it's something we need to talk about. But another part of it that people aren't talking about as much is the reality of how wind farms or solar farms have to be built. Now, recently in the Wall Street Journal, a gentleman by the name of Robert Bryce wrote an editorial, or wrote a column, headline, Rural America Gets Bad Vibrations from Big Wind. And essentially it's about a lot of what I would say a growing opposition to building wind farms in rural America, because where else would you build them, right? I mean, you can't build them in cities. You have to build them out in the countryside, and contrary to popular belief, people actually live out in rural America. Quite a few people live in rural America, and not all of them are necessarily enamored with the idea of putting up giant wind turbines, you know, very near their homes, because, you know, you look out, they obstruct the landscape, and it's not just an aesthetic thing. If you live close to one of these things, they're noisy. I go out I enjoy being in the outdoors, and I go out in North Dakota's countryside all the time, and I've had occasion to be near some of these things, and part of this just maybe my phobia is I'm scared of heights and stuff, so when I'm standing at the bottom looking up at one of these things, it's a little scary to look at, but they're noisy too. Robert also produced a report for a Minnesota think tank called the Center of the American Experiment. It's called Not in Our Backyard, and as I bring him on, that's one point that I want to make about this debate right away, because Robert, we hear all the time about the NIMBYism, right? Like the not in my backyard thing. And it's not typically a positive thing when people are bringing that up, right? Like I don't know that Sure. That's necessarily a positive reaction that people have. Sometimes it can be perceived, I think, as
I hate that term, by the way. I just hate this idea that NIMBYism, like, and not in my backyard.
Because it can seem
that people shouldn't care about their regions is right. Just it's silliness. I mean, you know, how right. dare them say not a, this is but to the point here, Rob. The report that I wrote for the Center of the American Experiment is called Not in Our Backyard. And right. I document the fact that since 2015, roughly it's now over 300 communities from Maine to Hawaii have rejected or restricted wind projects. This is happening all over the country, including in particular in North Dakota and Minnesota. So this is the hottest issue in the renewable right. business, is where they're going to put all this stuff. And
my point about it is sometimes I think NIMBYism, it can be perceived as hypocritical. And in some cases it is hypocritical, because you'll have people who are very staunch advocates of renewable energy who also don't want renewable energy projects, be they wind farms or solar farms, or depending on as the case may be, don't want them built near our home. And that is sure. absolutely hypocrisy. If you're going to be in favor of these things, you can't just say, I want it, but go put it in somebody else's backyard. That's not fair. But there is a reality to this where we've built a certain amount of energy on our grid now, renewable energy. To get to what some of the goals that people are talking about, and I was reading through your report here, and some of the goals, for instance, the Green New Deal, introduced in 2019, set a goal of 2030 to have every mobilize, I'm quoting now, this is from the plan, mobilize every aspect of American society to 100% clean and renewable energy by 2030. You're talking about Jennifer Granholm, our energy secretary under President Joe Biden, speaking in March. She said, I quote, "We have to add hundreds of gigawatts to the grid," talking about renewable energy, hundreds of gigawatts to the grid over the next 4 years. It's a huge amount, and there's so little time. Now, I think you and I, what your argument, how I take it, not in our backyard, is it's not NIMBYism per se. It's just a practical reality. Where are we going to put this stuff? Because to have that much energy, you have to have wind, not just wind turbines, right? We're not just talking about wind farms, but every wind farm also has to be serviced by transmission lines, too, that run out to it. If you build a coal plant, you have a singular facility that's sitting in one place that's going to have transmission lines running to it. But it's sitting in one place, and it's powering all sorts of homes and businesses from that one place. Wind farms are dispersed. They're all over the place. And to service, you have to build spider webs of transitions. So when I read this, I mean, my first reaction when somebody says, well, they're making a NIMBY argument and not in my backyard argument, my initial reaction is negative. But when I read deeper in what you were arguing here, this is something we have to grapple with. This is reality.
This is the binding constraint, and I like that phrase, the binding constraint on the expansion of wind and solar in the United States. It's the binding constraint in Western Europe. It's the binding constraint all over the world. The fundamental problem, and I've been following this, I've been reporting on the wind energy business for more than a decade. The wind energy sector, they don't like me because I'm pointing out all these problems, and I'm only doing it because I've been in rural America. I've talked to these people. I've talked to small town mayors and supervisors and individual landowners, many of whom have moved, some of whom have moved out of their homes because of the noise issue. And this, there's this branding. And Rob, let's cut to the chase here. What's happened? You have 70% of Americans say they want more wind energy, 80% want more solar, but they're not the ones that have to live next to these projects. And therein lies the big divide in America. It's an urban-rural divide. It's a class divide. But when it comes to the land use issue, this is the key constraint on this, this fanciful expansion, massive expansion of wind and solar that some of the top academic, institutions in America, Cal Berkeley, Stanford, Princeton, saying, oh yeah, we can just put it all out there, in flyover country. Well, they don't live out there. And after talking and over many years to people who live out in rural America, including in California and New York, they're saying, no, we don't want these projects here. It's going to reduce our values of our homes. It's going to ruin our view sheds. And we're concerned, and rightly so, about the noise pollution problem, because the noise pollution problem with the wind industry is one issue that they don't want to talk about, but it is a real and serious problem.
One thing that again, I'm reading from your report for the Center for the American Experiment. This is another citation that kind of blows my mind. It says, according to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, converting the domestic electric grid to run on renewables will require roughly doubling the amount of high voltage transmission capacity in the U.S. Now, you go on to cite, at present, the U.S. has about 240,000 miles of high voltage transmission. So that's about 250,000 miles. Therefore, renewables conversion means adding enough high voltage transmission lines to circle the Earth about 10 times. So to do that,
and it's just not going to happen, Rob. I mean, people all across the country are rejecting these high voltage transmission lines. Look at Missouri. Just in the Missouri legislature, the Missouri House passed a bill. It didn't pass the Senate. It wasn't signed into law, but they passed a bill prohibiting eminent domain for private high voltage transmission projects. This project has been held up in Missouri for 10 years. In Iowa, in 2017, the legislature there passed a ban on eminent domain for high voltage transmission projects. State of Arkansas, similar. This idea that we're going to build tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of miles of new high voltage transmission, again, it is remarkable to me. And I've been in journalism for 30 years. How uninformed the academics and the journalists who report on this are. We just need to build more high voltage transmission. I'm thinking, you think? You can't build a gas pipeline. Look at Dakota Access or a Keystone XL. You can't build a pipeline underground. You think you're going to put it 200 feet in the air? No, you're not.
I think we're part of the attitude. We had a big debate here in North Dakota in our legislature, and it was sort of pitted the tourism or recreation industry against the agriculture folks, the ranchers, the farmers, the people who own all that land out in the rural countryside. And it was over access, because in North Dakota, unless a landowner goes out and specifically posts their land, like they have to put up no trespassing or no hunting signs or whatever, it's presumed that you have access to that land. And during that debate, what was revealed is an attitude where I think a lot of people forget that all that land that they're driving through when they're going from here to there, and they're seeing cows and they're seeing crops, that somebody owns that. And in most cases, not only do they own it, that land is their livelihood. Like
exactly.
It's how they feed their children. It's how they put a roof over their heads. It's how they pay their bills. And so this idea that we're just going to build all these wind turbines, and they just forget that person who owns the land and has to live next to the wind turbines. It's
exactly.
like they're just forgotten about them. Like, well, that person will just say yes. Like, we'll just do whatever. And there's also another historical context, like building transmission lines has always been controversial. That's not a new thing. In fact, when they were building Coal Creek Station here in North Dakota back in, the 1970s, Coal Creek Station actually serves Minnesota. It's North Dakota's largest coal-fired power plant. It's Great River Energy announced that it was going to be closed, but now we're waiting. It sounds like there's a buyer for it that's going to continue to operate. Anyway, that's a whole other topic. But while they were building it, they built a transmission line across North Dakota to Minnesota. And if you go back and look up news reports at the time, the farmers were ticked about it. They were having these high power transmission lines. They didn't like it. I think it's and I'm not endorsing this. This is not appropriate behavior, but in some instances they were going out and they were like tipping over the towers before they had the lines on them. And that was a big deal. That was hard. So building this, it is a difficult thing to get the permissions and to get everybody to go along with building this sort of infrastructure. It's hard. We see it with pipelines. We see it with transmission lines. We see it with all of it. It's always hard. That's nothing new.
Any kind of infrastructure. And now they're roads, bridges, highways, putting aside, it's increasingly difficult. But let me give you a specific example in North Dakota, Rob, that to me is a good example of how the big media outlets in America, and I say this as somebody who's been in journalism, I published in some of the biggest newspapers in this country, they won't cover this story. So in 2017, as you well know, in Cannonball, North Dakota, you had all of the protests around the Dakota Access Pipeline. Hundreds of people arrested. Right, it was on the front page of the New York Times, and got national coverage for weeks at a time. During that same protest in Billings County, near Theodore Roosevelt National Park, the county rejected a 383 megawatt wind project, and the park officials spoke against it because they didn't want the view shed in the park to be ruined by the wind turbines. So at the same time, there's all this focus on Dakota Access, and people want to protest the pipeline. That's fine, but there was no attention given to this renewable energy project that was rejected because the locals didn't want it, and it was going to negatively impact tourism. So this is these land use conflicts are happening with all kinds of energy infrastructure. But the fundamental problem with renewables is that they require so much land. And here's one of the other points that I made in the Not in Our Backyard report. Just to meet existing electricity demand in the U.S. with wind energy, if you just use wind to do it, you would need a land area twice the size of the state of California, 900,000 square kilometers. Why is that relevant? Because you can't build wind in California because it's so unpopular. You can't build it in New York either.
Some of the states,
these are issues happening in states all across the country.
Some of the states you named in your report, like Vermont, California, which you just mentioned, surprised me. Like just speaking from a purely political perspective, I would have thought that these would be places that were very easy, given their who they vote for and their political proclivities. You would think it would be very easy to build wind power in some of these places, and you're saying no, which gets to your NIMBY argument, where people like the idea of wind turbines, but they don't want to live by one, or solar panels, as the case may be.
Exactly, and you mentioned Vermont. Bernie Sanders is the most vocal proponent for renewables in the U.S. Senate. I think that's clear. In 2016, he ran on a platform that was all about all renewables, converting the entire economy to renewable energy. That was his platform. He followed this scenario that was painted by a Stanford professor named Mark Jacobson. Bernie adopted that scenario whole cloth. Well, you can't build wind turbines in Vermont. The last wind project that was being proposed, I think it was last year, was withdrawn because of the staunch opposition. So this idea, well, where does Bernie think he's going to put all these wind turbines? Oh, somewhere else, right? Not in his state. Oh, some other state. Well, where is that exactly? The same thing is happening in New York. Some of the most democratic states in the country are where the wind energy is facing the fiercest opposition. And isn't that cute? I mean, that, in New York, where rural residents tend to be Republicans, the state is dominated by Democrats. And in fact, in New York, the wind energy is so unpopular, the state has passed a measure that will effectively allow the state to override local community regulations that are opposed to wind and solar because they're saying climate change trumps everything. I mean, this is getting to the point where the state is saying, oh no, eminent domain, King's X, carbon credit, carbon is the more important than local land rights and local regulation. It's truly remarkable.
I mean, it's somebody who is a proponent of building pipelines, because I think we should build oil pipelines. I think a lot of the controversy around them is just overblown and frankly a little silly. But I don't want to start trumping local governments. I mean, that regulatory process around building a pipeline is an example, and it's largely the same for transmission lines or whatever, insofar as you have to get, if you're crossing state lines, you have to have federal, approval, you have to have state level approval, and then a lot of times you have to go to counties and cities and townships and everything and get their approval. You have to negotiate with the landowners, and that's hard. It's an arduous process. But you know what? It should be an arduous process, and it shouldn't matter if we're talking about wind turbines or transmission lines or oil pipelines or natural gas pipelines or anything. It should be hard. It should be an exacting process, because that's the way government in America works. Now, we have a listener who's I think making a point that maybe a lot of people listening to this are maybe thinking. This person writes, imagine discussing the negatives of fossil fuel industry like so many people do with solar and wind. And I think the intent there is to be like, as if somehow we're making it sound like, fossil fuels are perfect and wonderful and we should use that because, renewables have all these problems. And that's not the point. The point is, if we want to use renewables, these are very real problems that you have to address. Like there's nothing more fundamental than where do you put the wind turbines? My point is there's no such thing as a free lunch in the energy business, the power business, anywhere else. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Every source of energy and power production has downsides. But the reason I wrote this report and the reason I'm so passionate about it is that it's not getting any of the attention that's being focused on all the hydrocarbon projects. There's, Dakota Access, the Keystone XL, all, those projects get, they get all kinds of media coverage. Did you know, Rob, and just a quick question. Did you know 200 people were arrested on the island of Oahu in late 2019 protesting a wind project? No, I hadn't heard that at all.
This is remarkable. 200 people, the largest act of civil disobedience against a renewable energy project likely in American history. 200 people arrested on the island of Oahu near the village of Kahuku didn't make the New York Times. Doesn't fit the narrative. Doesn't fit this idea of clean, right? But therein lies the key issue. And I'll mention the Not in Our Backyard report again, because one of the things in researching it that I thought was really quite interesting, and I've been in journalism for a while, was that I found a 2009 report, from the Minnesota Department of Health that documented the problems that wind farms are facing because of noise pollution. And in fact, it was this low intensity, they call it low intensity noise, was causing sleeplessness for people. And here was sleeplessness and headache are the most common health complaints and are highly correlated with annoyance complaints. So this issue of this problem of noise pollution from big wind has been known for more than a decade, and yet they've been able to bury it because, this social marketing and, frankly, tens of billions of dollars in subsidies from the federal government.
One, if people who are watching this, listening to this on YouTube, I've included links to Robert's report, Not in Our Backyard, on the Center of the American Experiment website. I also included a link to his recent column in the Wall Street Journal about it. So be sure to check those out. And I think what has always bothered me, because I'm not against wind power per se. I think it has a place. I think it's a technology that can be improved. I think it has a future. What worries me is that we're building too much, too fast, because we're pursuing artificial, and when I say artificial incentives, I mean incentives that are not market driven or demand driven, but rather politically driven. And so we're pursuing these incentives like massive subsidies. Like I think a lot of the rush to build wind power and solar panel power is that there's wind power in particular is that there's tax credits for them. And those tax credits are, they magically, they're supposed to have gone away a long time ago. They magically get renewed at the end of every year. And so I think there's a land rush to build it. And that's not, when that's happening, that's not about reality. That's not America needs wind power because it works. That's these companies need to build a bunch of wind power because they're going to get paid. That bothers me. We need to remove those perverse incentives so that as we develop wind power, it's driven by reality.
I couldn't have said it better. And that what we're seeing is that some of these companies, they're subsidy miners. They're not energy companies. Why are these big European companies coming to the United States? Avangrid, the Spanish company, why are they, Enel, EDF, why are they coming here, EDP, the Portuguese company? Why are they coming to build wind projects here? Because the tax credits, the federal production tax credit is so lucrative that they can get a lot of the project financing simply through the tax credits. Well, that's not the way the business is supposed to work. And I think to bring it back here, I live in Texas. I live in Austin. There was a lot of talk after the blizzard here and what happened after, why we had blackouts. Well, $66 billion was spent on solar and wind in the years before the blackouts, not on reliable sources of dispatchable power, but instead on wind and solar. Why? Because they were getting tens of billions of dollars in federal subsidies. That's why.
Our senators here in North Dakota, I think Senator Hoeven recently did a report. I mean, that was a wake-up call here in North Dakota, because when, losing power in Texas, and granted, I don't want to belittle what happened with that terrible blizzard. A lot of people were put at risk, but Texas usually has far more clement weather than North Dakota does, especially during the winter months. And losing power in North Dakota, generally, it's a matter of life or death. I mean, you could kill people, not to mention the potential for property damage and what have you. So that was a real wake-up call, because North Dakota had power outages too. The Southwest Power Pool that serves the northern part of Texas also serves parts of North Dakota. And the thing about it is this wasn't a one-off event. We have been very close to this happening before, both with SPP and the Meso Power Grid. And again, speaking about Senator Hoeven, he was talking about something like 30 times in the last several years that we have been at sort of like a condition red, where they were going to run out of power. It's happening all the time where the power grids, because maybe of some weather phenomena, maybe it's really hot or really cold, and they're having to borrow energy from other power grids. And increasingly, this is becoming the norm, and I guess we're just supposed to accept it, except if we're going to live in a society where our not only our safety, but our economic prosperity hinges on reliable and affordable power, we are pushing ourselves in a direction that is away from reliability at the very least, if not also affordability.
Well, again, Rob, we're singing from the same hymnal here, because this is the focus of I have a new book that came out last year. It's called A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations.
There we go.
And that's what I write about, that the electric grid is the mother network. It's the network upon which every other modern network depends. GPS, airport reservations, our traffic lights. We think about it when we take for granted the reliability of the electric grid, when actually it is a very fragile network that runs on very narrow tolerances. And that's what is clear to me in the wake of this disaster here in Texas, is that the politicians didn't understand the nature of what electricity is. They thought, we'll sell it like a commodity, like pork bellies or tortillas or hamburger. No. No, this is a critical service. And if you lose it, and the Texas grid came so close to total collapse and yet the legislature didn't really dig down in this legislative session that just ended to really address the issue of reliability. And so I'm exactly on the same page with you that adding all this intermittent renewables does not help the reliability and resilience of the grid.
you're at the end of your paper for the Center of the American Experiment. And again, those who want to read it, I have it linked in the YouTube description. I have it linked if you're watching on Inforum.com or the Grand Forks Herald or what have you. The links are in the article below the video that you're watching. You have some recommendations, and one is we talked about it a little bit is to get rid of some of the tax credits that are I feel like distorting it, because the natural flow of the market has natural indicators to tell you, hey, you're building too much of this, or hey, slow down, right? We have price signals, we have cost signals, and when the market obeys those things, generally things find their own workable equilibrium. Getting rid of those is one thing, but what are some of the other recommendations that you have for how we can move forward and not ban wind power or solar power? Again, nobody's talking about that, but how do we work and develop these things responsibly?
Well, I think one of them is, and we've talked about that already, is that local communities have to be respected. I mean, their views, their regulations, this idea as what's happening in New York is that, we're just going to run over these local communities. No. No, they have a right to regulate their land use in their jurisdictions. And the idea that, they shouldn't be allowed to because climate change trumps everything else. No, that's exactly wrong. I think that, I'll come back to an issue that I've been writing about now for more than a decade. If we're serious about reducing CO2 emissions, we're not going to get there with renewables, full stop. This idea of the all renewable delusion has been promoted by the Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, some of these biggest academic institutions in America. It's a delusion. It's a mirage. It's a joke, in fact, is what it is. A bad joke because of the land use problem, the mineral intensity, the land use, all these other issues that are coming together. But if we're serious about CO2 emissions, we need to get serious about nuclear energy. And unfortunately, we're not. And nuclear plants are being closed all across the country, including just on April 30th, Indian Point in Buchanan, New York. This is ridiculous. If CO2 is the existential crisis, if climate change, as the Biden administration claims, is the existential crisis, those plants should be kept open at not at any cost, but at whatever cost is needed to make them solvent. And then I think the last thing is like with the negative health impacts need to be assessed and need to be considered fairly, because there are serious negative health impacts caused by the noise pollution from wind turbines.
Well, to your last point, too, if we're going to, as the Biden administration is very enthusiastic about electric cars, and frankly, so am I. I think they're cool. I think Teslas are really cool. I think they have a bright future. They're not quite practical for everybody yet, but I think they could be. I'm excited to see how the technology rolls out, because I'm not some sort of a Luddite, curmudgeon. But if we're going to push towards a future of electric cars, that's you're transferring a lot of energy, a lot of American energy production from gasoline and gas stations and fuel pumps to the energy grid that, I'm sorry, is not ready for it. Right, the production's not ready for it, the transmission lines aren't ready for it, but yet somehow we're just going to sally forth into this future. It's madness, Robert. Which again, I'm preaching to the choir a little bit. So, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think we've hit on the big issues, Rob. But I do encourage people to read that report, and in addition, look at the database. And this is one of the reasons why I've been in journalism for a long time. I'm affiliated with the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity here in Austin, but I affiliated and did this report for the Center of the American Experiment because Minnesota has been one of the hotspots for this backlash against big wind. And so if you go to the center's website, you can also see the database, which is being updated regularly with where wind projects are being rejected or restricted. And now there are 302, if memory serves. So, it's not just a couple, and it's not just a few years. In fact, since 2015, and I've collected this database over the last 7 years, you can read these things yourself and see what's happening in local communities. You won't read about it in the New York Times, but you will read it in small town newspapers and smaller town television stations.
And the thing is, because I write a lot about energy here in North Dakota and obviously Minnesota as well, but I don't pick up on national trends sometimes. And so when I was looking at this database, it surprised me how this was happening all over the country. I mean, I knew it was happening in my neck of the woods. I didn't realize it was happening. So like you said, eye-opening stuff, worth taking a look. Robert, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks a million, Rob.